This is Money Mind on CNA 938. I'm Chu Wee Lin with Susan Ng. Now, the eggs you just bought, they come from Malaysia, and that dress in your wardrobe, chances are it could be from Vietnam or somewhere else. We may be living in Singapore, but we can get hold of goods from all over the world, and that's all thanks to the complex network of supply chains.
But sometimes events that happen, world events, and in this particular case, COVID-19, it's changed all of that. We've seen so many things happen. We've seen actually some upside, Whelan, I have to mention. You talked about eggs and it coming from our neighboring country.
Yeah, that's right.
But recently I bought eggs from Ukraine, I think. Or was it Poland?
Wow. Were they any good?
Yeah, they were great. I mean, and they were cheap. They were like $2 for 10 eggs. And I went to a local supermarket, and you bought two 10s, you get a third one free. So that was a good deal. But the eggs were great. As my family said, they're eggs, right? I said, yes, but these eggs were really nice. They had bright orange yolks. Always makes me feel good to see an egg on my plate or in my bowl with a bright orange yolk. Somehow it makes me feel good. So I think what we're seeing is also eggs and other produce coming from further afield than the traditional source of food. So we've seen a lot of things happen during the time of COVID-19. Aside from new products coming from new places, we've also seen supply chains sometimes broken, and there have been retailers, businesses, and some F&B businesses who weren't able to get their products from traditional sources.
Right.
And perhaps they weren't able to put out the foods and produce maybe the cakes that they wanted to. Remember at one time there was a shortage of eggs? I remember we sat here and talked about...
We did have that conversation about eggs.
About eggs, and I said to someone, why eggs? And they said, when you're at home, you need actually eggs. It's a quick meal. You fry an egg.
Fast to cook, good to eat, right?
Correct, absolutely, to borrow a line.
Yeah.
And it goes into everything. And people were baking a lot.
That's right, because there were no cakes.
People, the home bakers, right? So the term circuit baker was then coined. And so people were baking a lot. And so I found that, myself, I was buying not just one tray of 10 eggs, but multiple trays. And people were buying multiple trays of 30, and we were wondering why. Well, that's the reason why, people were doing that. And so shipments are delayed and things weren't able to come to Singapore. And we also see sometimes, food being discarded. And although businesses have thrived, they're the ones with the very robust and resilient supply chains. So supply chains, you were right to ask that question earlier. It's difficult to put that into perspective when you're not thinking further than that dress you're wearing. And you said earlier, the dress you're wearing, it's made in some other country. And I'm sure that with a designer who's coming up, Daniel Boy, to talk about his fashion show, in order to put a fashion show together, you need that supply chain, right?
That's right,
You just think, okay, dress, model. Okay, what happens to dress model before dress model gets onto the catwalk? Something happens. So back to our topic for the morning, which is about supply chains. We've seen during COVID-19 that supply chains and shipments were disrupted, were delayed, there were goods stuck at customs, and people weren't able to receive what they needed to receive in order to get their products out there. But the ones who were able to, the businesses that thrived, were the ones who had some resilient supply chains. They were able to get products across to people even during the pandemic that we had. So what is needed to build such supply chains? Well, we're talking about this today with Senthil Ramani, who is Managing Director and Digital Transformation Innovation Lead for Growth Markets with Accenture. Senthil, thank you for making time to join us today.
Thank you so much for having me, and let me wish you and the viewers and listeners a very happy National Day.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, Senthil, let's start off with the impact on supply chain of companies in Singapore and the Asia Pacific when COVID-19 hit us.
Absolutely. Let me just give you a bit of a backdrop on this, right? Asia's consumer market is worth 56 trillion by 2030. And I have to tell you, the supply chains are the backbone to be able to achieve that. And if you zoom into Singapore, we've become a global leader in logistics hub for many, many years now. And there are many years that Singapore will continue to be in that position of strength. The reason is our solid physical and digital infrastructure that we've actually placed, as well as being the world's largest transshipment hub, right, with connections to over 600 ports, as well as being one of the world's busiest cargo airports, if you will, right? We've constantly been ranked top in the World Bank's Logistics Performance Index. Now, having said this, the pandemic has no doubt altered the supply chain landscape, right? But I think there are a lot of opportunities within Southeast Asia that we're seeing here. And two things that are driving it is one is really the proximity to China. And the second thing is the alternate viable options that we have because of the infrastructure that we've actually built in Singapore. Let me just give you an example, right? And this is a very positive example of what one might also call a positive disruption for a large and a leading consumer goods company in Singapore that we are working with. Their e-commerce sales has gone up by 3-4x, right, in the past 4 months. And this has warranted very different and superior supply chain capabilities, which include last mile delivery and the understanding of the customers really, really well. So the future of supply chain, like you rightly said, is going to be defined one of resilience. And whichever companies, whichever organizations, whichever countries provide that resilience are going to enhance their competitiveness.
Right, but how vulnerable are our supply chains? Because we did see some of them partly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and I believe Susan gave the example earlier of how the eggs, for a while, they've been coming from Malaysia, and during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw them coming from places as far-flung as Poland. That
is right. Listen, the pandemic has created never-seen-before disruptions in supply chain, no question about it. In fact, I would summarize this into three major disruptions. If you look at it from a short term, we are certainly seeing a demand, fall. The focus is clearly on speed and cost, and the focus is really on essential goods and services across the supply chain. The second thing that we are seeing is the need to diversify the supply chain, exactly back to your point. Nearshoring it and keeping it as close to customers is becoming the new mantra, if you will. And the third thing is, in Asia, one of the interesting other dimensions we face is there are varying degrees of the pandemic, right, with the cyclicity of lockdowns happening. So that also creates the disruption in the supply chain. While this is happening in the short term, I'm a little more positive in the outlook for the medium term and the long term for Singapore and Southeast Asia.
SMEs make up 99% of enterprises here. Let's talk about them and the strength of the supply chains of Singapore businesses.
Sure. The first and foremost that needs to continue is safe supply chain practices. Safety and health are probably the topmost considerations right now for any supply chain company, being our SMEs, our local companies, as well as some of our global companies. Now, the local companies need to pivot into a 3R strategy, as we call it, which is resilience, relevance, and reimagination. Let me just unpack it for you. From a resilience perspective, like we were just discussing, it's the new normal. It means diversifying, variabilizing your cost structures, ability to understand demand better, and continuing to invest on security. The investment on security, both physical and cybersecurity, is an infinite game. It just doesn't stop. It moves on. So that is important as well. From a relevance perspective, the supply chains need to move from one of an inside-out supply chain to an outside-in, which means understanding the customer, where is the customer based, what are the practices the customer actually really requires, and building your supply chains based on this. This particular piece on relevance could become extremely critical for Singapore in the future. And the last thing is on reimagination, right? Newer supply chains warrant broadening your ecosystem, especially regional integration in Singapore and Southeast Asia is pivotal right now for us to make that happen. Fundamental to all this is investment in digital platforms, as well as the investment on the talent infrastructure that we have in Singapore, right? So if you look at the digital platforms, application of artificial intelligence has become really critical right now because you want to be able to sense demand better and react dynamically. And the investment on reskilling and new skilling is really, really important for the future because in general, from the shop floor to the top floor, people need to be able to appreciate data, artificial intelligence, blockchain, and other technologies as well.
Right. You talk about this investment in technology, but won't this drive up costs, and can we expect the costs to then be passed on to the consumers?
Listen, the initial investment on technology will incur some costs, yes. But again, if you look at it from a medium-term, long-term perspective, automation, robotics is the future very clearly. And that actually is going to increase and enhance the competitiveness of Singapore. And that is extremely critical also to move into the dynamic kind of supply chain that I was talking about, which is resilient by nature.
Let's talk about the supply chain issue with the focus mainly now on China, which is also known as the factory of the world. How important are APAC and Singapore companies in supply chains? Talk to us about the roles that they play.
Sure. If you actually look at it, what is happening with China is benefited Southeast Asia and many other countries because of the proximity. And the proximity is extremely important, back to this point on keeping supply chain as close to possible to the customers. So if you look at it, Southeast Asia is starting to become an really interesting and an alternative viable to China. The second important thing is the rising growth in the region is actually enabling us to actually power up our supply chains. In fact, what I would say is newer supply chains are being created and crafted every day. And Singapore is in a position of strength. The reason is because of the IP that we hold in an ability to actually take the IP and move the IP and help other countries as they are building their newer supply chains. Singapore has always been a safer location for IP and the protection of IP. So that is also going to be an extremely important criteria for us. And the higher degree of automation and efficiency that we can actually get to is going to enable us with the free trade agreements that are available, for us. So if you really sum up these 8 factors that I just explained right now to you, there is a significant shift to Southeast Asia in supply chain, point number 1. And point number 2 is that this is really going to enable us to grow in a medium and the long-term basis, irrespective of what is happening with China. And it should not be viewed as a binary, whether it happens in China or not. It would continue. This new seismic shift will continue in the supply chain, and we have to be ready to be resilient to build all these into the region here.
All right. Thank you very much for your insights. We've been speaking with Senthil Ramani, Managing Director and Digital Transformation Innovation Lead for Growth Markets with Accenture, and he's been speaking to us about the importance of supply chains.